So I'm a little late on this, but Persona 5 Tactica is the newest installment to the Persona franchise.
Persona 5 Tactica.
This game, while sharing a lot of the same styles and themes that made Persona 5, like the super chill music and atmosphere, it does have more of a chibi art style and uses a new tactical gameplay style as opposed to the turn-based combat that you can find in Persona 5.
Hit him hard!
The team behind Persona felt that there was a lack of tactical games in the Persona profile, and they felt like it had potential for expanding the possibilities of their series. This to me just comes off as alright, let's make a Persona tactical game, but instead of a full commitment, let's just milk Persona 5 just a little bit more. Which, hey, makes sense. I did some research on the Persona franchise, and it sold about 17 million units overall, and Persona 5 makes up 8.5 million of those, so basically half of all Persona sales are from Persona 5 alone, which makes sense to reuse this franchise over and over again and just test out the new combat mechanics here. And the combat of this game is pretty enjoyable. It's a standard tactics game setup where you swap turns with the enemies, moving through the map, using cover and elevations to your advantage, and you usually have a clear objective, but it does have a couple weird things going on. That said, I want to cover the story first before the gameplay, as I feel most folks enjoy Persona for the narrative reasons than the gameplay reasons. Just to get out of the way, I did play Persona 5, and I love the style and overall feel of that game. I really think the music and the visual art style that game uses, both in and out of combat, makes it something truly special, and really just makes Persona 5 stand out overall. But I never actually finished it, and why? Because the story is very long and drawn out, and relationship mechanics in games just really aren't my thing, and my interest just sort of faded over time. Now, Tactica isn't nearly as long as Persona 5, and it doesn't have any relationship mechanics, but it does have that very long out, drawn writing style which was present in Persona 5. And since this game starts out with you having a lot of characters, it feels like everyone kind of has to put their 2 cents in, which can make cutscenes even longer at times. Now, I don't mind story-driven tactics games, usually they're narrative-driven anyway, but it does kind of have that anime feel to it, because every time something happens, the characters feel a need to re-explain it and tell you how you're supposed to feel, which I feel is kind of common in the Persona franchise. Just the writing style they use. And the overall topics this game has aren't nearly as dark or deep as they were in Persona 5. One gets close, but in my opinion, it just doesn't lean into it hard enough, and the story mostly focuses around one specific individual, a candidate who's going to be the Prime Minister of Japan who mysteriously vanishes, and through various events, the Phantom Thieves end up having to essentially help him deal with all his various personal issues and traumas, which, hey, changing hearts is what the Phantom Thieves do. And the topics this game deals with are being in an abusive relationship, committing misdeeds for political gain, some childhood guilt, and the game has an overall very strong feeling of rebellion and standing up for what you think is right, running throughout the entire game. There is another character you're introduced to first, and she's a little bit more interesting than he is, but she kind of falls to the wayside after a while, and the story mostly becomes driven by him and his experiences instead of hers. Which there's actually a good plot reason for that, but I don't really want to spoil it since this is such a narrative-driven game. Overall, I didn't mind this story too much. It felt a little bit wordy at times, and it does kind of beat you over the head with its themes repetitively. And I do feel like the first and second chapter are a little too similar to each other, both in story and gameplay perspectives, which kind of made me lose interest a little bit. And it wasn't until the later acts where they actually started switching things up that it kind of roped me back in again and got a little bit heavier. But again, I wish it leaned into some of those heavier themes just a little bit more. Story aside, the gameplay is pretty solid, but it does do a couple odd things that aren't usually found in tactics games. For example, cover works a lot differently in this game than it does in other tactics games. Your characters and enemies can both hide behind cover, both full size and half size, which reduce your damage taken, which is what you would expect when you go into cover, but there's no flanking mechanics in this game, and I feel like when you flank an enemy unit, they should be taking full damage, and you should get the advantage there. This would increase the difficulty of the game a little bit, which I think is actually something that it needs, which I'll talk about later. But in most tactics games, they give you a tactical bonus when you flank an enemy, and it gives you that bonus damage, and the fact that it's not here just feels a little odd. That said, though, the game does give you bonuses in different ways. For example, there's a one more mechanic, which the way this works is when you attack an enemy who's not in cover and you down them, you get a whole extra turn. Now, how do you get enemies out of cover if you can't flank them? Well, that's where your Persona abilities come in. Once you hit them with a Persona ability or spell, they immediately get taken out of cover, even if they're standing next to it, which again is kind of odd. This one more mechanic can be interesting though, because it can cause some interesting scenarios and challenges, because there are some cases where you get extra turns over and over again, and you can move to like the complete other side of the map. It even makes some interesting extra bonus challenges happen, where you have to defeat hordes of enemies in only one turn, or go at an extreme distance with only one turn, and you have to plan out each one more attack, and it's just kind of interesting. And moving around this map is pretty well encouraged. I find in a lot of tactics games, they usually want you to kind of keep all your units close together, and you don't want to scatter your units because if they get isolated, well, they're going to die. But in this game, it's kind of the opposite. You actually want to spread out your units a little bit. Now, the reason you're going to want to spread them out a little bit is because if you down an enemy, you can then activate an all-out attack. And what that attack is it makes a triangle with all your Phantom Thieves, so the more they're spread out, the bigger the triangle is going to get. And this attack does a huge AoE attack to anyone within the triangle. And with proper positioning, you can cover a lot of space and you can do a lot of damage to a lot of enemies fast. And in some cases, with bosses, you have to use this in order to hit certain objects that you may not usually be able to target or attack by conditional means. Now, this all-out attack is actually something that was in the original Persona 5, and just like in that game, you're going to want to abuse it, and it can feel a little too strong at times. But the animation's fun, so it's nice to look at. Now, pretty much all characters in this game have a melee attack as well as a unique gun they equip that allows them to do their usual base attacks, as well as equipping personas which give them abilities. By equipping different personas, characters can get up to 2 additional moves, be them passives or active abilities, that they usually can't get throughout their skill trees, and you also get various stat boosts for using different personas of different levels. Now, most characters will learn most of their abilities through their skill tree, and each character does have a unique element that they specialize in, and as you progress, you can kind of decide if you want them to be more single target or AoE or melee based, but near the end they do kind of start feeling the same, and especially when you start mixing in the personas, because then they can start having different elements and sometimes they can kind of feel a little bit like the same character. That said, they all do have unique supers, but again, a couple of them are very similar to each other, they just change the element around. And there are a few differences in the skill trees, like some characters might counter a little bit more, and some characters have healing spells, other characters have buff spells. Each skill tree does though kind of lean them more towards a specific strength and attribute, but again, there just happens to be some crossover because there's so many characters. And as mentioned, there is the personas, which means the persona system is here, and I guess it's kind of similar to 5. You unlock personas after each fight, and you can level them up, which increase their stats, and you can additionally use the Velvet Room to fuse them together to unlock new personas, and even fuse them together to unlock special personas. And there's a whole compendium that you can fill too. It's like a whole Pokedex going on. I'm sure there's a way to min-max these personas and to optimally do it, but I just didn't have the patience to go through and fully fill out the entire Pokedex of personas. But yeah, I guess if you're into collectathons, that can be a really fun thing to do. Now, while you have a lot of characters in this game, you can actually only use 3 characters at a time, and they sort of do encourage you though to keep switching it up as you get stat bonuses for your rested characters when you bring them in from the previous battle, and usually you do about 3 battles in a row before you get about 15 minutes of talking, so you can switch up your parties, but again, the stats are probably so negligible that you really don't have to do it. I just did it for a little bit of variety. And as for difficulty, I think this game really struggles. I'm by no means a tactical genius ready for Ender's Game, and I played this game on normal for the first chunk, and it felt a little bit easy, so I decided let's just crank it up all the way to the hardest difficulty and see what happens, and I honestly didn't feel that much of a difference other than the enemies having more health and dealing out a little bit more damage. It does also add friendly fire, but that didn't really add any stress to any situation. Even on this difficulty mode, I felt like I rarely ever lost a teammate in battle, and it kind of doesn't really matter because after a while you eventually unlock a once a game death save anyways, and even if they do die, you just baton pass to the next character and bring in another one of your characters, so it really feels hard to lose at times. The only times I ever really lost were at later levels, and these were more puzzle solving challenges where you might have to do something in 1 or 2 turns, but these function as more environmental puzzles, and they weren't really based or difficult because of the enemies around. And bosses kind of have the same issue too, as they're not really hard, it's just you have to figure out the puzzle around them that makes them difficult, which these can be fun to solve, don't get me wrong, but it's not hard by any means. And the first 2 chapters or kingdom of this game feel super similar, like a lot of the levels are the same and the enemies are the same, and it really just kind of got old after a while, and near the end of the second chapter they finally start introducing new enemies and new environmental mechanics, but it kind of feels strange they didn't pace it out a little bit better. And yeah, this game did this weird thing where as soon as I started getting tired of something or sick of it, and I found myself complaining about it, it all of a sudden changed and updated. Like when I was starting to get sick of the levels, I sort of complained, and all of a sudden I started getting new level designs, and when I was like, are there going to be any new different styles of enemies? I started getting new enemies. But again, I don't know why they just weren't spread out better. I mean, there was plenty of room for a cannon type enemy in the first kingdom, and there was a ninja and everything, and they should have just pasted it a little bit better. But yeah, even with the addition of these new enemies, the bulk of the enemies are all kind of the same. They're just the same guy with different hats on, which is a nice visual twist, but from a gameplay perspective, it really doesn't change anything. And because of the story pacing and the ease of the gameplay overall, it does feel like a much more chill experience than an actually hard, challenging tactics game, which I feel like is pretty much what they were going for, as that was kind of the design and vibe that Persona 5 had overall, through the music and your main hub being a coffee shop, and it really is just kind of a chill game overall, which kind of worked out because I had the flu when I played this game, so I really wanted a chill experience anyway, and that's also why it took me a little bit longer to get this video out. And this is a fairly straightforward tactics game overall. I mean, there isn't an overabundance of mechanics and interactables, and it's mostly just you move your character, you do your attacks, and you carry out an objective, such as kill all the enemies, reach the escape point, move the box from A to B, like and subscribe to this channel, and it does have a couple mechanics that do make it unique, but they feel a little bit odd at times. I think overall, if you enjoy anime-driven story-style narratives, this could be an enjoyable experience. It doesn't have the standout power that Persona 5 has, but I mean, it is a spin-off, and I do feel like this is a good first attempt for this style and is a good foundation for a tactics game, but there's a lot of stuff that could be added onto it, and while I feel like the story wasn't terrible, it did struggle to retain my interest at times. It also kind of expects you to kind of already know who the Phantom Thieves are, and even though you can make RPG choices with Joker, most of the time it doesn't really matter, as sometimes the options are just straight up the same, and I really don't think there's any story differences at all. I think this game is something mostly for people who just wanted more Persona 5 and maybe use it as a baby's first tactics game, I don't know. Either way though, I think this is more of a on sale pickup, and the fact that it already released with DLC content and missions does kind of rub me sour a little bit. Overall, it was an enjoyable experience, but yeah, I think it is a for sale pickup, but hey, it did help me ride out the flu, and it was chill to play while I was sipping on my coffee and waiting for my Sudafed to kick in.
Don't fuck with me! I have the power of God and anime on my side!
Wait,
That's really all I have to say about this game. Later, nerds.